Well, welcome back to everybody who has rejoined from the break and everybody who is joining for the first time on Zoom. We have a very full and exciting final session of our first day. Before we begin, I too would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on unceded Gadigal land and pay my respect to Aboriginal elders past, present, and emerging, and also to all First Nations people presenting and participating in this conference over the next few days. Our first presenter in this series of 4 presenters will be presenting live. Our first 2 presenters will. And then we will have 2 presenters who will be presenting via Zoom. We've pre-recorded the lectures or the presentations for the people that are presenting off-site. So we'll be streaming them here, and then we'll be doing the Q&A via satellite connection between where people are dispersed around the globe, which is very exciting. But I'll begin with someone who is here in the flesh. Nathan Cox has forged a career as a versatile musician working in a wide range of modes, from main stage period instrument ensembles through to developing an eclectic, fully improvised series of micro shows for Sydney Festival in 2022. He's appeared with many ensembles, both in Australia and internationally, and has performed as guest principal harpsichordist with the Tasmanian, Adelaide, and Sydney Symphony Orchestras, and the Auckland Philharmonia Orchestra. Nathan is currently undertaking his doctoral studies at the Sydney Conservatorium, investigating German organ accompaniment practices from the 18th century. He is here today to present a paper titled Convicts, Computers, and Culture, Acoustic Life of Farm Sheds at Old Wesleydale. Please join me in welcoming Nathan.
Well, thank you, everybody. Following its premiere at the 10 Days on the Island Festival in Tasmania, the award-winning Acoustic Life of Sheds project, created by Tasmanian arts and social justice organisation hART, has seen ongoing performances in both Tasmania and mainland Australia. In the time following its inaugural performance in 2015, it has engaged 90 composers, musicians, visual artists, audio artists, and filmmakers, and has led to the generation of 26 new works. This project, perhaps best summarized as a site-specific multimodal event, celebrates the shed as an embodiment of farm, rural, and maritime culture, revealing the often invisible stories of place and the people who toiled within these sheds. The creators, Scott Rankin and Andrew Viney, describe sheds with an almost romantic wistfulness, as sentinel shapes on the horizon, watching as life changes around them. They consider sheds as bastions of time, space, and purpose, as places where shipwrights, apprentices, farmers, labourers, and artisans carry on their working lives in these unassuming spaces, leaving a patina from their toils. Speaking from my own experience growing up in rural New South Wales and spending many hours in sheds, the concept immediately resonated with me. Here, the project's creators conceptualized sheds as memory sound shells, with the artist acting as a transmitter, reimagining the space for audiences and telling a story of its inhabitants. The format of this reimagining varies from shed to shed, from a more traditional layout with designated seating for the audience, all the way to a non-linear format where audiences can freely wander during the performance and explore the spaces for themselves. Each restaging of the production is focused on a central theme and features a circuit of 3 to 5 sheds, with audiences traveling in groups sequentially from one shed to the next. The creative teams assigned to each space do not interact with the other teams, but rather each shed remains an artistically separate entity unto itself. The project's creators also remind the teams that the performance happens just as much through the audience's conversations as they travel between venues as it does during each performance. In late 2021, I received an invitation almost by chance from a colleague to take part in the production of The Acoustic Life of Sheds as a part of Sydney Festival, which took place earlier this year. This production focused on Sydney Harbour's distant and more recent past as a working harbour, with a series of 4 locations billed in the festival program as a soundscape where places shaped by time, trade, each one bearing the unique patina of decades of service. Audiences would depart from the National Maritime Museum aboard 2 historic Sydney ferries, where they would travel to the location throughout Sydney Harbour, disembarking at each stop along the route to hear each performance. I was joined by 3 other members of the creative team: Hobart-based vocalist, trumpet player and improviser Sabine Bester, shipwright Lockie Rankin, and sound designer Jim Atkins. Our boat shed was in a railway viaduct in Lavender Bay, just across the harbour in North Sydney, a location which was once the hub of local boat building since the late 19th century. In the present day, however, only one boat builder remains, Rob Gordon, who continues the tradition of his father, Bob Gordon, who began building boats in Lavender Bay in 1945. Our brief was to develop a 20-minute long show, drawing on inspiration from the lives of the individuals working in this space. How we were supposed to achieve this retelling through sound was left purposely vague by the director and production team. Instead, we were instructed to, as far as possible, not impose any preconceived ideas, but rather become a transmitter for the shed, reimagining the space in the moment for audiences. The creators, Scott and Andrew, wrote in the program that Acoustic Life of Sheds takes more producing than directing. Once the musicians, artists, and shipwrights enter these beautiful spaces and listen, the project directs itself. It was also included in our brief that this performance be largely improvised, allowing us to be as free as possible when interpreting the sights, sounds, smells, and feels of the space we are inhabiting. This task was, of course, the antithesis of what I was taught to do during my years of study at the Conservatorium. Up to that point, my previous experience was firmly rooted in the mainstream classical world, cycling between hours of individual practice and rehearsals, which were devoted to performing pieces from the musical canon. This cycle would culminate in a performance where the virtues of accuracy and correctness were implicitly valued over risk-taking and novelty in the moment. I had never been taught how to improvise, but despite my initial uneasiness about taking part in this project, it turned out to be a uniquely fulfilling experience, challenging me in ways that simply would not have happened in the world of mainstream performance. As a musician specializing in historical keyboard instruments, I perform not just on harpsichord, my main instrument, but also occasionally on other 17th and 18th century keyboard instruments, such as clavichord, forte piano, and organ. Because of the outdoor setting, these delicate instruments would have been impractical to use. There was, however, an alternative. In 2017, I was introduced to virtual organ software by my colleague Grace Chan, who was presenting a paper after me. This software, called hART, was first launched in 2002 as a high-performance sampling software specifically designed for the live playback of pre-recorded organ sounds. This software represents a significant step over and above that of other electronic or digital instruments. Instead of recording a single note from a real instrument and modulating the pitch to simulate every note of the keyboard, hART instead relies on high-fidelity recordings made of every single pipe in an organ. Some pipes are even recorded multiple times, each with different speeds of attack, mimicking the varieties of pipe speech of real organs. This process ensures that the subtle differences in timbre and speech of each note is preserved, creating a greater sense of realism. A full sample set of an organ often amounts to thousands of individual sound files, creating what is in effect a sonic snapshot of the organ. Sound files are stored in the computer's RAM, where they can be retrieved almost instantaneously in response to an input from a device such as a MIDI keyboard. Other functions of an organ are also replicated within hART, facilitating the use of several MIDI keyboards to interface with the multiple manuals and pedal board of the organ. Here you can see some of the hardware I was using for the Lavender Bay performances, with the 2 MIDI keyboards in front of me corresponding to the upper and lower organ manuals, and a smaller keyboard off to my right side for the pedal board. Multiple pairs of speakers were positioned in each archway, hidden from the audience's view. This was done with the intention of making the archways appear as if they were singing to each other. The application of hART shares many parallels with elements of my PhD, where I employ virtual organs alongside other musicians, blending acoustic and virtual instruments together in performances of 18th century German church music. In this context, I utilize the virtual instrument as an alternative to the anachronistic portable organs, which are almost exclusively used as the go-to continuo instrument, rather than the more stylistically appropriate large church organ. Dozens of organs recorded by third-party engineers are available for purchase, allowing organists to choose from amongst some of the world's most famous and historically significant organs. For this particular project, I chose a sample set of the organ in the Petrikirche in Freiburg, Germany, which was built in 1735 by Saxon organ builder Gottfried Silbermann. The sample set was recorded by Czech company Sonos Paradisi. I'd like to play now for you a brief video from one of our performances at Lavender Bay. In August, the performance was restaged for the Agriculture Festival in northwest Tasmania. The collective theme of the project pivoted from a lament on the bygone era of Sydney's working harbour to one of cultural justice, with 3 environmental themes of water, climate and soil divided across the 3 sheds. Combined, these 3 sheds form a triptych of sensibilities, examining European perspectives, intercultural exchanges and Aboriginal nations respectively. Our team was given the environmental theme of water, with the keywords journey, separation, arrival, and before. We were also given the following prompt. This imposing stone barn speaks back beyond times when dynasties built fortunes on unceded country. It speaks of European architectural languages and a time before these stones rose in this landscape. Trapped by migration, torn apart, lost at sea, or in prison, these 2 figures tell a water story that defined the beginnings of modern Tasmania. Perhaps these lovers are separated by time, circumstance, crime, hope. And in their interruption, they knew little of what this island arrival would unleash on a land across the water, where they would cut an ignorant and savage swath before they learned to love this place and be loved by it. The same creative team was assembled. This time our shed was a 2-storey stone barn built in the early 1830s on a property known as Old Wesleydale, named after the devout Wesleyan Methodist Henry Reed when the property was sold to him in 1837. I was positioned on the lower level of the barn against a stack of hay bales, with a mixing desk and an array of speakers placed on the upper level out of sight of the audience. The other performers, Sabine and Lockie, were also placed on the lower level, along with a wooden boat brought up from Hobart. In this new setting, the Hauptwerk software proved to be a key driving force in the reimagining, propelling us as a group to experiment and build upon the ideas from our earlier performances in Lavender Bay, helping us form new connections with and draw inspiration from the space around us. Through the novel application of this software, I sought to help convey the themes of penal transportation, isolation, and the earliest European settlement. On a more metaphysical level, the sound of the organ, captured digitally and virtually transported from its native church to colonial Tasmania, provides a fitting parallel with the barn we were now in, which was built by convict labour. With the experience of Lavender Bay performances under my belt, this second mounting of the performance afforded me an opportunity to reflect on the earlier staging and experiment more with the sound we were creating. At the core of this experimentation was the virtual organ, which acted as a fitting vehicle for exploration. Organs by nature are inextricably linked to the acoustic they are positioned in. One of the native features of Hauptwerk allows the user to apply various artificial acoustics to the output. in essence enabling the user to virtually move the organ between churches with various lengths of reverberation. This new stone place, with its proportions reminiscent of a cathedral, prompted me to experiment further with the amount of reverberation. Here I chose to add an 8-second reverberation with the aim of creating an expansive field of sound, complementing the cathedral-like space we were now in. An additional element that we experimented with was how the sound of the organ was channeled throughout the space. This was done by strategically mapping the audio output from the computer to individual speakers. The software allows individual audio channels to be virtually piped to specific speakers, and by assigning each of the 2 MIDI keyboards in front of me to pairs of antiphonally positioned speakers, I was able to control the flow of sounds between the opposite sides of the barn, encouraging members of the audience to freely wander around the space, drawing their attention to salient moments in the performance. For this performance, I also chose to draw my experience as a harpsichordist and continuo player, where the bulk of my professional life is spent improvising chordal accompaniments. The extemporaneous realization of a chordal accompaniment from figured bass is in many ways more akin to a form of sight reading rather than learning the individual chords by rote. Chordal progressions, inversions, as well as the preparation and resolution of dissonances is embodied into the hands, enabling the player to make split-second decisions in the moment. Using this as a starting point, I adopted a more organ-like sustained and chordal approach, drawing on elements from Baroque harmonic patterns and idiomatic organ writing. Reflecting back on the Lavender Bay performances, I also decided to adopt a more traditional approach, combining stops together, creating a sonority which is more distinctly organ-like, aiming to invoke an almost sacred mood within our stone cathedral. To close this paper, I'd like to play for you a brief excerpt from one of the performances. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. Questions? We're also taking questions from people on Zoom, so if you've got a question, please use your raise hand function. I'll start off with a question, Nathan. I'm wondering what the audience reaction to these installations has been, in particular the Lavender Bay one. The distance between Sydney as a working harbour and Sydney now, maybe like Lavender Bay is like this. There's a lot of distance that's been traveled there in terms of its transformation. So did you have any old salties there that were telling stories about how it used to be?
Constantly, every day. In fact, we had the neighbourhood. We rehearsed several days in advance in the actual space where we were in the performances, and we had in the middle of a rehearsal, we had this man walk down the hill and asked, "Is there a point to this?" And it was a noise complaint. But I was wondering, well, that is the question: what are we actually here to do? But it was incredible how no two people had the same comment. It was incredibly varied, and everyone drew their own interpretation from that. In almost a way, the ideas that I came away from that performance was with what the audience told me they thought the performance was about. And so I found it evoked something in a lot of the people who lived in around the area for quite a few many years. So it was certainly enlightening to see the perspectives of people who had lived there and seen the harbour change in their own lifetimes.
It's kind of a profound way of voicing a noise complaint. Is there a point to this?
Yes, we were hoping he would tell us.
Yeah. Other questions?
Thanks, Nick. The sounds that you guys were coming out with. What is the next step for the Acoustic Life of Sheds? Is this going to hit every city and rural country town?
Well, I would love that. In fact, the idea I'm trying to pitch to them currently is because I'm where I grew up in Coonabarabran. We have on the road out to the main observatory there is a lot of the astronomers who live in the town have built their own little observatories outside the town. And so I was proposing the acoustic life of observatories, performing inside domes and how the sound reflects over the top. But the beautiful thing about this format is that it's transferable to just about any case. There's the acoustic life of boat sheds, of farm sheds, there is at least two other ones, but I've forgotten. But it's an incredible concept in how it can be molded to fit the local landscape. Thank you.
Other questions?
To be the reason for the workout, Anthony and Chris. Nathan, what a fascinating presentation and what a wonderful initiative.
Thank you.
I'd just really be interested to hear your thoughts on one very specific point you alluded to in your presentation, which is that your training, as mine was very much originally in sort of the mainstream, classical tradition of you need to make sure you don't miss notes and you don't even do anything that might offend somebody. In what ways do you think, I'm sure you teach in some capacity, I see a staff card around your neck. In what ways do you think the insights and the sort of practice-led work that you've done here might actually inform perhaps educational models or ways of going about these things that perhaps aren't so much about just don't offend anybody and miss notes, and a bit more about actually make a difference or make people contemplate what constitutes a noise complaint?
Well, I would say as far as that, what it helped, not so much in a nuts and bolts musical sense, but what it helped personally in my own journey with this, it helped to dissolve the silos between what is improvised music, what is mainstream, what is this very reasonably artistic performance, as opposed to your trotting out on stage and performing. And for me, the moment came quite clearly just as I was getting ready to prepare for the Acoustic Life of Farm Sheds, where I thought, well, I've just come off the back of playing organ continuo accompanying a solo voice on an organ. How is that any different to what I'm doing next week? Actually, what is it? I'm playing on a virtual instrument. The dots aren't actually written down on the page for me. But other than that, it's not as if I'm not using my ears. It's not as if I'm trying to intuit their body language. So my main takeaway was that it helped, in a way, make me become more aware of my practice as a professional musician, and how these skills are immediately transferable across. Music is just music.
Very important realization. Thank you.
I might ask the final question if there's more. This is more of a practical question, Nathan, but I'm wondering about your your procedures for figuring out how to activate the space. Like, would you do experiments in there together, beforehand as a way of sort of prepping yourself for what might work in improvisation, or was it all?
It was all very organic in the moment. It was quite, in a way, under-rehearsed, which was almost on purpose to try and keep things as active and as in the moment as possible. So, but of course we had a various other, our sound designer helped and walked across the space, and he lended us his ears, but in the other moment, most of it was a whim. I would just occasionally pre-record while I was playing, and then play it back and walk around the space. And you think, wouldn't that be interesting if I heard this sound but over there? And so it was more this wasn't so much my own creativity that sparked these decisions, but more or less, well, look, this software is incredibly powerful. Let's see what we can do with it. How far can I route individual pipes on opposite sides? And the software was the catalyst for this. And gave me this vehicle to experiment as much as I dreamed, really.
Well, that's wonderful. Really, really interesting and beautiful music. Please join me in thanking Nathan again for his presentation.